Hey, it's Vanessa Hardy from Long and Foster, and I wanted to pick up on the tail end of the last video I did about selling an estate where you find out there's a person living in the property and you just weren't expecting that. One of the things we started to talk about is, well, there may be some solutions for you that don't involve going to court. So, going to court, hiring a lawyer, I think in all instances, you need to sit down and talk to a lawyer. And the best way to do that is to pay for a lawyer's time to get some really solid advice. In some cases, the best way to proceed is going to be an eviction process, going through the courts to get an order to remove the person from the house. And in other instances, you may work with your attorney and work out a cash for keys, which is essentially an agreement with that person in the property to move out of the property and get a little bit of cash from you so they can be on their way and find another home to live in. So there are a couple of avenues, and in fact, I have seen instances like this where landlords chose the cash keys or chose the eviction process. So I mentioned in an earlier video that I had this very strange situation where one of my clients had a tenant murdered, and then someone kind of snuck into the property that the deceased tenant had been living in, and that person who got into the property was not a tenant, not on the lease, and the court had to step in. The client decided he did not want to try to negotiate with this person. He didn't know that person. As far as the landlord was concerned, that person was a squatter. And so the landlord decided, I'm going to hire an attorney. I'm going to go through the legal process and get an order to remove the person from the property. And he was successful, hired an attorney went through the process, and they got an order from the sheriff to U.S. Marshal to remove the person. And I think the person actually moved out on the very day that the marshal was coming. So he didn't have that much stuff in the property. Fortunately, there wasn't any kind of weird incident. He just pretty much picked up and walked out, never looked back on that day that he was going to have the formal eviction. So I think that whole process maybe took about 10 months. It definitely was not short. And my client was very fortunate because the person living in the property never showed up at court. So at all stages, the person did not object to what was going on. I suspect the person knew what the process was, probably knew that they were going to have almost a year to live in this property without having to pay rent. And, they said, hey, when the time was up, they were like, all right, time's up. I'm going to move on. I'll move on somewhere else. So my client was lucky. We have all seen news reports where people are trying to evict someone from a property, a squatter, let's say, and the squatter knows all of the ins and outs of the legal process, and the squatter is using every possible legal remedy to slow the process down. So my client was lucky in that instance that this person in his property never fought the eviction and just left when the time was up. So that's a really good thing. So I think my client maybe paid around $5,000. I think maybe between $5,000 and $7,000. So the legal fees didn't add up because the lawyers didn't have to do a lot of intense legal work on the eviction. So I'm not suggesting that anyone happily pays $5,000 to $7,000 in a situation like this. But my client was fortunate that it could get very expensive if you have someone in the property who feels they have a legal right to be there and they use all of the remedies that are available and should be available to people who are legally in a property. So it can get much more expensive than $5,000 to $7,000. But I want to tell you about another case because I think this is instructive. It wasn't until I started thinking about this, I didn't realize I had so many properties with tenants who had passed away. But I had another client who had a tenant who passed away. And in this case, the landlord knew that there were at least two people living in that property that were not on the lease and not legally allowed to be there. So the one person who was on the lease, the one person who was supposed to be living there and was paying rent, that person got sick, passed away, and now there are two people living in the apartment who really had no legal right to be there. They weren't paying rent. They knew that they weren't on the lease and really didn't have a right to be there, but nonetheless, they were there, and they knew he couldn't just change the locks, turn off the utilities. He couldn't do anything like that. He couldn't use self-help tactics. These people knew that. So they actually came to an agreement. The owner of the building sort of knew these people, knew them enough that they could communicate. They came up with an agreement. The owner chose to pay the two people. They signed something in writing. The two people left the property, and at the front steps of the property, the owner gave the people the money that they agreed to exchange, cash for keys. And so the people who were leaving, they had some money to go to make their way to a new home. And the owner was very happy because he didn't have to go through the eviction process. So that is something that you can do. Now, I will tell you, nobody enjoys giving money to someone who is in a property, and let's say that owner or the heirs of an estate. Nobody likes the idea of giving money to someone who they feel like doesn't have a right to be in their property. But let me make sure you're clear on this. There is estate law, there's real estate sales contract law, and then there's landlord tenant law. And landlord tenant law, it just rides over everything, particularly in Washington, D.C. So just the fact that someone has passed away, just the fact that a landlord wants to terminate a lease, the fact that a landlord wants to sell the property, none of those things trump landlord tenant law. So that's why I mentioned in an earlier video that if you need an attorney, if you inherit an estate and then find out someone is living in the property, you need not just an estate attorney, you need an estate attorney who's also familiar with landlord tenant law. So the landlord tenant law piece, it overrides everything. And that is what you need to be familiar with in order to determine, does it make sense for me to go through the court process, or does it make more sense for me to have my attorney help me with a cash for keys type of an arrangement? And then even the agreement that you make is really going to be heavily weighted with what your landlord tenant law situation is. So the good news is you don't always have to go to court. You don't always have to go through the eviction process to get someone out. And you always want to think about, would it be cheaper for me to pay this person and come up with a friendly agreement? Or do I deal with trying to keep a property well maintained with someone living there who doesn't communicate with me about what's going on? Am I paying mortgage, taxes, all kinds of things? All things to think about when you're weighing whether or not it makes sense to just go the cash for keys route rather than go the route of an eviction process. I'm Vanessa Hardy from Long & Foster, and I work with people in these kind of complicated real estate situations. Please feel free to use me as a resource.